Is this thing on? All right, so old dog is gonna try to learn a new trick, all right? I don't do video lectures often. It's something I'm just learning how to do. So feel free to let me know if it was helpful. On a positive, you could rewatch it as many times as you want. Got some props. I got my skeleton. And I have my chalkboard, okay? So we are covering the hip joint right now. And we went over sagittal plane motion of the hip. And I went over illusion stuff, right? It looks like it's moving and it is. It doesn't look like it's moving and it's not. And then the illusion of it looks like it's not moving, or it looks like it's moving and it's not. And then my right hip, it looks like it's not moving and it is. So that was sagittal. Remember the hip being a ball and socket, it's triaxial. So that means it can move in the sagittal plane. That's going to be our flexion and extension. And then our transverse plane is going to look like this. I have these broken models that I'm going to use to try to show you transverse plane motion. So transverse is going to be here. All right, let me get that. If I could get that hand out the way. And stay. Okay, so sagittal motion in the fetal, out of fetal, flexion, extension. Transverse plane motion, just like knee, internal medial, external lateral. And remember, motion from a joint is illusion. The joints are articulations between two objects. So not only do we have flexion when the femur moves about the socket, the ilium, ischium, and pubis, but we also have flexion when the socket moves about the femur. So that's how that works. If this is flexion, so is this. You actually create the same angle change, right? So in other words, from here to here is the exact same if I move them both. Extension, flexion, extension, flexion, extension, okay? So that's how that works. And in the transverse plane, I have internal, external, internal, external, medial, lateral. How it would look if the femur stayed fixed and the pelvis rotates, it would be internal, external, internal, external. So from here to there would give me the same changes from here to there. Notice how it's the exact same change. It gets to the same place. I'd have to externally rotate it to go back home. I'd have to externally rotate it to go back home. So when I have my feet on the ground and I'm rotating the sockets, internal rotation, external rotation of the right hip, okay? All right. Now, today on the video lecture, I'm gonna go over ab and adduction. So ab and adduction, let me put these guys down because I'm old. Ab and adduction are phrases that we use for frontal plane motions. And a common way to look at it is movement away or towards the midline. You can get away with that for the hip because the hip doesn't have as much motion. You're a lot more stable at your hip than you are at your shoulder, right? So my shoulder can get me all the way up here because I have to do over the head stuff at the trade-off of stability. Hips don't do that. Hips can get us so much, but we can't afford to have dislocated hips, or we become prey, easy prey, way back in the day. So using midline, you can get away with it for the hips, but that's not how I like to look at it. I like to look at it as a clock. Our limbs, our legs and our arms are like the hands of a clock, okay? So let's see if I can draw a bold clock. Oh gosh, man, that looks like a broken egg. I apologize. Well, it's artistic. We'll just say it's an artistic clock. And the way I want you to view ab and adduction is imagine a clock hand and I have 2 clocks. This is going to be my right, this is going to be my left, okay? All right, so right and left, does that make sense? Okay, right and left. And abduction and adduction, as listed in your books, are rotations in the frontal plane away, initially, away from 6 o'clock, okay? So what I mean by that is, if you think of your hip as being the clock hand at 6, if you go away from 6, right? So my left would go, right, it would go from 6 to 5 to 4 to 3, it would go away from 6, that would be abducting, A-B, away from 6. Now the reason I say 6 and not midline is because your shoulder, when it goes away from the midline, that's all fun and games until all of a sudden you get to 90 degrees and you start coming back towards the midline. And that's where people can get confused, because you have this towards and away set in stone, but this is the same rotation the entire way, right? It's, in other words, if I thought of this clock hand as rotating, this would be counterclockwise, right? I didn't change the rotation, I have the same rotation. This is the whole time. So if you do that whole midline game, it gets confusing, because once you get here, you start coming back towards the midline, and you have muscles that are trying to pull you back. You're going to be in biomechanics. I'm going to teach you about some of those midway special muscles. So the point is that I like to look at it as away from 6, because the whole time you're going up, you're going away from 6. Even 12 o'clock is further away from 6 o'clock, right? So if you rotate 180 degrees, you're farther away from 6, as opposed to saying away from a midline, because again, eventually you can come back towards the midline. And for some people, that could be very confusing, okay? So we have 6 o'clock, and when the hips rotate away from 6, we call that abduction, A-B-B-B-B-B-B-B-B-B-B-B-B-B. And when the hips rotate back towards 6, A-D-D-D-D-D-D-D-D-D-D. Now remember, it's the direction of spin. There's literally not a 6 o'clock. But I told you why I like to use that term for midline purposes. Remember, it's about the direction of spin. You have 2 double doors. Even though they're rotating differently globally, they're rotating the same locally, open, close. It's the same thing for the hips. Bilateral ab-ba-ba-ba. So even though they're rotating globally different, right? One's going from 6 to 5 to 4 to 3. The other's going from 6 to 7, 8 to 9. It's about the direction of spin. Right hip ab-ba-ba-ba. Left hip ab-ba-ba-ba. Now I don't know how the video is going to flip it, so it might be confusing if I say, just trust me, this is my right hip, this is my left hip. Right hip ab-ba-ba-ba. Left hip ab-ba-ba-ba-ba. Bilateral ab-ba-ba-ba-ba. Now, because it's the global direction of spin, that means that I can have even if I come across, that's still adduction. And that can get a little confusing, because you're like, whoa, man, you went past 6 o'clock. Remember, the whole 6 o'clock is just meant to show you the initial rotations. So from anatomical position, if I'm going to go away from 6 like this, that just shows you the direction of motion for ababa. Then you can reverse it to see the direction for adda, okay? Ababa and ads. Now, adduction is the opposite of abduction. Gets tricky. Not because the motions are tricky, it's just because the words sound a lot alike. In high school, I had friends that I graduated with, and their names were Heath and Keith. They look nothing alike, fraternal twins, but yet their names are so close, it was easy, especially when we were younger, to get them confused. You know, hey Keith, I'm Keith, or hey Heath, I'm Keith, hey Keith, I'm Heath. It's because their names are so close, even though they didn't look alike. So that's kind of how ab and adduction are. I mean, there's just one letter, and that letter sounds the same. Abad, 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 and especially how fast Cajuns talk, right? Abduction, adduction. You can see how these two terms, so what I try to do is I try to use the term AB to emphasize the away from 6, and AD to emphasize the toward 6. I'll say that in class as well. Right hip, right hip, and it's kind of silly, it helps to remember. Left hip, left hip, okay? Abduction, adduction. Now, it looks like it's moving, and it is. Right hip, ab, right hip, add. Left hip, ab, left hip, add. Bilateral hip, ab, bilateral hip, add, okay? It looks like it's not moving, and it's not. Okay, I know you want that one on the test. Now let's go with, it looks like it's moving, but it's not. I'm gonna do the same exact scenario I gave in class with the sagittal. So watch this, I think this is cool. If I turn myself and pivoted about my right hip, and remember in class I said I had a cast or where I couldn't move my hip if I tried. So it looks like it's extending because your instinct is to use a global reference, but the hip joint isn't going anywhere. I'm actually flexing my right hip. I can still move my left hip, but if I kept it in anatomical position, it could stay in anatomical position, although it looks like it's extending. So I'm going to take the exact same concept, but just change it to the frontal plane. So in other words, if I rock to the side on my right leg, it might look like my clock hand stayed at 6 o'clock. But the reality is what happened is that even though I kept my clock hand still, I actually moved my clock, the socket itself, right? So what I'm saying is that abduction could be moving the clock hand about the clock or moving the clock about the clock hand. Notice how it's the same change. From A to B is the exact same as from A to B. Do you see that? So the illusion here is that my clock hand didn't move. You're right, but I moved the clock. And if I moved the clock, then that meant that clock hand is not facing 6 anymore. It's facing a new number. So I don't have to move the clock hand to get it facing a different number, to get it to move away or towards 6, because the clock hand means nothing without the interface of the clock itself. Okay. Right hip abduction. And if I keep my left hip in anatomical, it looks like it's abducting, but what's happening here is that I'm moving the clock hand and the clock. And when I move the clock hand and the clock, now it can stay at 6 o'clock. It could stay at 6. Now, from here, I could ab and abduct, but if I tell you that I keep my left leg in anatomical position, I want you to see how it looks like it's going away from the midline. But yet it may not be going away from the midline because it has a midline. Its anatomical position doesn't care about a midline. And its anatomical position doesn't care about your belly button. Its anatomical position doesn't care about those global references. Okay? Right hip, left hip, nothing. It looks like there's motion, but there's none. It looks like there's no motion, but there is. If I froze both hips and then rotated back to my left leg without changing anything, this is how it would be, because I had this motion. Just instead of moving the clock hand, I moved the clock. Another way, hopefully you can see it, is if we reference my pelvis, my sockets, right? So the pelvis, the sockets of the hips, the ilium and pubis form the pelvic girdle. It's a solid block. And it gives a little bit of frontal plane rotation, just a little bit, but I can't independently move the right and left pelvis like I can the scapula. Right? It's kind of like bedrock that your spine is, your skyscraper is built off of, and your hips on the bottom. Inferior, you have your hip articulation. Superior, you have your spinal column. So my point is that what I want you to see is when I do this, if you tilt your head, right ear, right shoulder, left ear, left shoulder, I'm not sure how this video is gonna post, but if you tilt your head to look at the pelvis like you did, like if it was level, and just notice how the clock and the clock hand are still at 6 o'clock, but yet my right leg is deviated away from 6 o'clock. Abducted. Right hip, abba. Left hip, abba. Left hip, add-da-da-da. Right hip, abba. Right hip, add-da-da-da-da. Left hip, abba. Cool? Now, that's the easy stuff. The harder stuff comes with functional tasks that we do, where we utilize our pelvis. Remember, when I say pelvis, that means the sockets. The sockets live on the pelvis. So when we shift weight, right, when we go from weight bearing mostly on our right side to weight bearing mode, when we're shifting weight, or you know, if you ever people watch at the mall, you might see someone walking like this. They're doing a lot of ab and adduction when they're walking like this. Ab and adduction. Okay, so what I'm going to show you next is how both hips, just like when we went over transverse, when I did the swing and I said, hey, right hip internal, left hip external, right hip internal, left hip external. Well, if both feet are on the ground and I adduct one side, the other side has to adduct unless I'm gonna fall over, unless I'm balancing on the other end, right? My point is that if I keep both feet on the ground, both of these suckers got to do something. They both have to move, okay? To emphasize this point, I'm going to keep my spine in its anatomical position, okay? So in other words, I'm not going to deviate my spine to cancel out what my pelvis is doing, okay? So remember, I did, hey, look at this, and now what I'm going to do is look at this. My right hip is still abducted, but my left hip is now adducted. Right hip, left hip, adducted. Remember, the whole away from 6 is just the initial way of showing you direction of motion. Keep going. Left hip, right hip, Now eventually I'm going to show you how the trunk is going to bend back to help keep your center of mass over your base of support, keep your eyes level. But if I showed you the trunk now, it would hide what's happening at the hips. Okay? So you should be able to do these on your own. Cool? All right. Are we having fun yet? Let's do some jumping jacks, right? What was that? What was this? What if I just did this? What's this? What's if this stayed straight in anatomical and I did this deviated? What's that called? What about bringing it back? What about this stays in anatomical position and I do this? What was that called? What about when I bring it back? Okay. Sagittal plane stuff. What's this at the hips? What's this at the knees? What's this at the ankles? What about coming back up? Ankles, knees, hips. Let's do it together. Analyze motion joint by joint. What did my hips do? Bilateral hip flexion. What did my knees do? Bilateral knee flexion. What did my ankles do? Bilateral ankle joint dorsiflexion. Coming back up, plantar flexion of my ankles, extension of my knees, extension of my hips. And random, because I know you guys like it. I'll tell you how to work on it, working on it. Okay, so hip flexion, extension, hip abduction, adduction. Specifically, right hip flexion, right hip extension, right hip ab, right hip add, right hip external, right hip internal. Left hip flexion, left hip extension, left hip ab, left hip add, left hip external, left hip internal. What would it look like when I move the other bone about first bone? It'd look like this. Right hip flexion, right hip extension, or maybe a different view of it. Right hip flexion, right hip extension. Ab and add, right hip ab, right hip add, da 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 da. Right hip external rotation, right hip internal rotation. Maybe if I back up, you could see my feet. Right hip external. Let me show you why this is external. If I brought my hip back to anatomical position and I moved my femur about the socket and I said, hey femur, externally rotate about the socket, you'd see this. Get me to the same place. So if I start here and say, hey socket, rotate about the femur, this is what you get. Another way to look at it is, oh, I'm not quite sure. I know it's the hip, but I'm not quite sure. How would my hip have to rotate to go back home? Wouldn't it have to internally rotate to go back home? So therefore I had to externally rotate it when I left home, this being home, okay? So that's gonna be your challenge, is for the hip, understanding that the hip has a lot of motions, right? Well, it doesn't have a lot of motions. It has 6 main motions from anatomical position. It has a lot of combinational things. So ball and sockets, what I mean by that is, I'm going to use the ball and socket on my shoulder to show you. I can move sagittal, I can move frontal, but technically I can move any combination of the two, right? But those aren't new planes. I don't have a million different planes. I just have all sagittal, no frontal. Mostly sagittal with a little bit of frontal. Less sagittal with more frontal. Half and half. Half sagittal, half frontal. More frontal with less sagittal. Almost all frontal with just a little bit of sagittal, and then finally all frontal. That's how it works. That it's a combination. It's moving 3 knobs on an Etch-a-Sketch, and when you turn 2 knobs, you can make it do a lot of stuff. And if we had the 3rd knob, you make it go into the 3rd dimension. Okay. So before we get into that crazy matrix stuff, though, we have to get the basics down. We have to get the basics down of sagittal, frontal, transverse, and then once we have those basics, then we can start playing with the knobs to get into combinational motions where I can have a combination of flexion and abduction. There's nothing wrong with that. And how we would communicate it is, on the test, I'd say, let's say since we're on the hips, right? Let's say one I did in the sagittal, easy, flexion, extension. One I did the frontal, easy, ab, add. But let's say I did a combination. I went forward and out, right? Well, on the test, I might say the sagittal component of that motion would be what? Flexion component. The part that went in the sagittal would be flexion. And the part that went in the frontal would be the abduction. I'd have a combination of flexion and abduction. There's precedence here. Not every road is, if you have directional on your car, not every road is north, south, east, west. Sometimes you're going northwest. Sometimes you're going southeast. Sometimes you're moving in a combination of directions. And it's the same thing for rotational directions. You can move in a combination. Okay, So it's not that it's a new dimension, it's just a combination of 2, sometimes 3 dimensions. Because I can do sagittal frontal, and if I rotate my hip, I could have transverse in there. Okay? All right. Now on to a couple other issues of the hip. There's a lot of motion at the hip, a lot of motion at the shoulder. Ball and socket's the most movable joints. So because there is a lot of mobility, we do have to set some reference points to certain planes of motion. I'll explain to you why that's the case, but you know, unlike an ankle or a knee, or maybe the elbow is the best one to show you, right? So in other words, whether or not I'm moving my humerus about my ulna or my ulna about my humerus, it's going to be the same plane, right? They can't deviate from it. But the hip's a little different. What I mean by that is because I can go sagittal, frontal, and transverse, sequence really matters. In other words, if I externally rotate first and then go out to the side, you see how my toe is now out to the side? That makes a big difference than if I flex first and put my toe out to the side, or abduct first and then toe my toe to the side. What I mean by that is flexing externally rotated looks different than flexing in anatomical, or even looks different flexing internally rotated. A lot easier example for me to show you is with the shoulder, just because it allows more motion. But here's what I'm trying to get to, okay? We know this is the anterior part of my arm, the front part of my arm. And let's say this is my little bicep, okay? The long bone of this relationship, whether it be the femur at the hip or the humerus at the shoulder, the long bone gets one perspective. It gets the transverse plane perspective. It gets the internal and external rotation perspective. I'll tell you why. The socket, right? Whether it's the pelvis, the ilium pubic, the acetabulum, the socket of the femur, right? Or the glenoid fossa of the shoulder, that shallow socket. They're both sockets. Just one's deeper than the other, but they're both sockets. A golf tee is still a socket. They get the sagittal and the frontal. And again, there's a reason for it. The reason is because if I didn't communicate those perspectives, life would be kind of tough if I flexed and extended where the anterior part of my arm was moving forward. Well, what if I kept the anterior part facing you and then externally rotated my body? Well, now you'd say, well, I'm still doing the exact same motion. And you'd be right from the long bone's perspective. It's doing the same thing here as it was here. However, this is going to get me more into out of fetal. This is going away or towards 6 o'clock. So the perspective of sagittal and frontal belong to the socket. So that way it doesn't matter if I'm here, here, there, anywhere here, I'm still flexing and extending. And it doesn't matter if I'm doing an empty can for you athletic training majors, or if I'm doing a lateral raise, or if I'm externally rotated. And then I can do abduction while being internally rotated. Or I can do abduction while being externally rotated. Or I could do abduction while being in anatomical. So the internal and external rotation belong to the long bone's perspective of things, and the flexion, extension, ab and ad belong to the socket's perspective of that. I'll give some more examples of that shortly. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to cover in this video before I do a review of everything is variations of abba and adda. You can only move in 3 dimensions at any given time, 3 planes of motion 3 dimensions of motion. However, you can change, because the hips and the shoulders allow so much movement, you can have a variation of the AB and AD duction that's significant enough that we give it a variant name. What do I mean by that? Well, in anatomical position, here's my 3 planes: flex, extend, ab, add, internal, external. Hips, ab, add, flex, extend, external, internal, okay? However, and it's a lot easier for me to show you my shoulders, and then I'll apply it to my knees. However, if I duct, okay? Remember, 6 o'clock, I go away from 6 o'clock. I can get back to 6 o'clock 2 different dimensions. I can do it from my frontal plane back towards 6, regular add, However, I can also do it now in my trunk's transverse plane. Not my long bones transverse plane, but my socket's transverse plane, my trunk's transverse plane. I got back to 6. In fact, how do I know I'm back to 6? Because if I extend at 6 o'clock. Now, where I don't have a 4th dimension, because when I'm here, the internal and external rotation is now taken up sagittal, if you think of it like that. Going back to 6 down here would be frontal, and then now this would be transverse, okay? So there's a variation of ab and add called horizontal ab and adduction. So that's when you're sitting upright and you have the little thigh master exercises, or you're doing the little thigh exercises on the machines. That would be a variation of ab and adduction, horizontal AB and horizontal AD, okay? In class, eventually, not on this lecture, but eventually we're gonna get into some examples where I'm gonna need you to see horizontal AB, horizontal AD, as well as internal rotation or external rotation. So we're gonna slow play that, okay? But I'm just introducing you to these concepts, and hopefully you can watch this video several times and email me questions, and okay, so let's review. Let's do a little quick review. Ankle, right? Talus, fibula, tibia. Remember I said you're gonna have to know the bones that articulate it. Uniaxial hinge joint. That means it can move in 1 dimension. That means we have to account for 2 motions. Flexion happens in 2 different ways: foot on the ground, foot off the ground. Plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. I wish these guys moved more. They're kind of stiff. Okay. The subtalar and transverse dorsal joints. Subtalar, submarine under the water, subtalar under the talus. These guys do this, right? They kind of glide and roll and dissipate force. When all of them glide to the medial side, we call that inversion. When they all glide to the lateral side, we call it eversion. Then we talked about the modified hinge joint of the knee, trochanteric, fetal, out of fetal, flexion, extension. When the knee is flexed, we get some rotation, lateral, medial. In this case, this would be lateral rotation, this would be medial rotation, this would be his left. Can I show him one more time? Okay, bud. Left external, left internal. Remember, the knee joint is formed strictly by the tibia and the femur. That's where the articulation is. Look, the fibula lives close, but there's no articulation there. The patella has nothing to do with the actual flexion and extension. It serves as a pulley for some muscles and as a protector of the knee anteriorly. We have a separate joint that we call the patellofemoral joint, okay? So although the patella is involved in knee function, it's not involved in knee motion. In other words, if I was a wizard, and I could be like, patella vedavra, and remove it, you'd still be able to flex and extend. Okay. The hip, the bones of the hip, you got four that you're gonna have to know. 1, 2, 3, 4. Femur, ilium, ischium, pubis. Ilium, ischium, pubis are synarthrodial. They're fused. They're fused in there for obvious reasons, right? We need some cement up in here, up in here. So the femur can move about the socket, but also the socket can move about the femur, as I did before, okay? So that is your lower extremity joints and motions that you're responsible for. Hip flexion, extension, ab adduction, internal, external rotation. Then we have a variation of ab and adduction. Another way I like to look at the variation of ab and ad, the horizontal AB and AD, is if I took that clock from the wall and I said, okay, that's regular AB and AD, life is good, right? But what if I took the clock off the wall, rotated the clock, just like if I would do this, I would move the clock hand in a new dimension. If I flex my hips, I would move the clock hand in another direction. Well, now that clock being here can still go away or towards 6 o'clock, just in a new plane, Now it's doing, you know, the humerus and the femur is like, hey, I'm still going away and towards, and that's all fine and dandy. But there are some muscle changes that are gonna happen. Like, I'm gonna have some different muscles that get into the game, pulling me straight down to my thorax versus pulling across my thorax. So because there are some differences in the orthokinematics and specific musculature involved, you know, we give it a variant name, okay, a variational name, horizontal AB and adduction, but the concept is still the same. Now, remember that 6 o'clock is meant to just be a teaching tool. Anatomical, however, if I keep moving this hand, that's still adduction. It's direction of motion. It's not meant literally to be anytime you go away or towards 6. You know, it's hard to do it. It's hard to go further away from 6 because you got your trunk that gets in the way. But when you're here and truck ain't in the way, you can definitely go across further into adduction. That's not hyper, that's my normal range of motion. I don't have it here because I literally have a soft endpoint, very soft. Soft endpoint that's preventing any further motion. But if this wasn't here, or if I was skinnier, I could get a little bit more, right? So this is still adduction. When you do this, you're adducting your shoulder. When you do this, maybe stretch it like this, horizontally abducting, horizontally adducting. And remember, it doesn't matter about the rotation. You're horizontally adducting whether you're externally rotated, you're horizontally adducting whether you're internally rotated, because it's not from the perspective of the long bone. The long bone has the internal and external rotation. Internal, external, 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 internal, external. That comes in handy because when I taught you, it was spin lateral, spin medial. But if I'm in these new positions, right, you may say, well, how is that spinning lateral and medial? And I'm like, well, when you move the humerus, its perspective of spin moves with it. So to it, it's just doing the same thing as it was down here. It doesn't know that you're no longer medial and lateral, right? So here it's doing the exact same thing, spinning the 2 ways it can spin. So we give rotation, the long bone. Remember, pure rotation is things that are spinning about the center of mass of the object, right? There's no translation, or there's minimal translation. So flexion, extension, that's a lot of general stuff. The internal and external rotation is through the long bone's axis, right? It's like the log. It's like the log on the water. You can't lift up a 2,000-pound log, but you could sure as heck stand on it and rotate it and spin it, because you're not doing any work on the center of mass. Center of mass stays in the same place. So my point is that that center of mass is staying in the same place longitudinally in the long bones transverse plane. Whether you're here, 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 it's still passing. That axis moves with it, right? Because it's relative. It's a local reference. So even when you're here, right, the rotation is passing through the long bone of just the humerus, okay? Internal, external rotation. Same thing for the femur. Now, I told you there was a few curveballs with, and I said this in class, where your temptation is to see foot come in and say internal rotation. Because for my shoulder, when I internally rotate, I see my hand come into the midline. And it's another reason why I don't particularly like using midline type global concepts, because sometimes they can trick you. So because the knee flexes posteriorly, actually what's happening is I'm externally rotating. Left hip external rotation, knee flexion, left hip flexion, left hip external rotation, and that's how I cross my leg. So I actually have external rotation to cross and internal rotation to uncross, okay? Another one that I've typically done sometimes in classes, I've stood with my knee flexed, okay, knee flexed, and I've done stuff like this. How would my hip be rotating? This would be external, this would be internal. Maybe it's harder to see because my knee was flexed, but I'm doing the same thing here to here as I am here to here. It's just that my foot's covering a much larger arc distance, okay? So, some advice. Get into small groups. Skype if you can't. Get into small groups. Practice the language. Practice the language. The more you can find people to talk about it, the better you're going to be at speaking it. The better you're going to be with coming up with practical examples in the house, work, the gym. One of the cool things about this material is that you can literally practice it if you're awake. You know, you're getting dressed in the morning, you're moving. Practice your motions and your positions and your planes, and you're in the weight room and you're doing leg day. Think about the motions, and if you can't walk and chew gum at the same time, that's cool. Analyze someone else's motion. And if they come to you and they say, bro, why you keep watching me? You're like, bro, I'm just studying, man. It's all good. Well, why you have to have popcorn and a soda? Okay, well, that's preference. But my point is that you can practice this stuff. And if you get into trouble, well, I'm not quite sure. I was watching someone do an exercise and I wasn't quite sure of what motions. That's why I'm here. Come early. Stay late. Help me help you. Okay? Help me. I want to help. But you have to help me help you. I don't know what you need clarification if you don't come to me for clarification, okay? So your homework is to practice this stuff in activities of daily living. You're walking to your car. What's happening at my ankles? What's happening at my knees? What's happening at my hips? You bend over to pick up a coin from the ground. What's happening in my lower extremities? Or reverse it. And if you're with a partner, or just use the voices in your head. How would I perform left hip adduction while standing? Left hip adduction while standing. Okay, well, first thing I'm going to do is stand. Left hip adduction. Well, to go back home, I got to leave home. So I got to have abduction first, and then left hip adduction. To me, that's the most efficient way to practice in a study, okay? I genuinely want everyone to pass. I do. I don't get any more or less credit if you do or don't. But you got to help yourself, okay? And I know you can. So rewatch the video. Your assignment for Monday class and Wednesday class is this video. I want you to watch it twice. And your homework is going to be to practice what you watched. Okay? Cool? Okay, paper, rock, scissors. Best 2 out of 3. Okay, you ready? Winner gets bragging rights. And to make sure you watch this video, I want you to email me and let me know who won. Okay? It's 1, 2, 3, and then shoot. None of this like 1, 2, and 3, right? 1, 2, 3, shoot. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3, shoot. Did I get you, or did I get cut? All right, here we go. Round 2. 1, 2, 3, shoot. Did I get you? Did I cut you? Or did you bash me over the head with a rock? Okay. That might ended the game for some people. Maybe I lost, maybe I won, but maybe we tied. So we got to do some more, okay? So this is overtime. 1, 2, 3, shoot. Must be some acid rock. Acid paper. Overtime. 1, 2, 3, shoot. 1, 2, 3, shoot. 1, 2, 3, shoot. If we didn't settle it by then, we ain't never gonna settle it. Okay? So have a good fall break, everyone. I'm gonna be visiting Dr. Jesse Hodges at Palmer Chiropractic early in the week. So if you need me, email me, and be safe.